Jasmine Porter was just days away from her 37th birthday in February 1996, and her little boy shared the same birthday. He was nearly 5 when a killer came calling and took the life of his pregnant mom.
Jeremy heard his mother scream. He heard her tell him to run. He was 4 years old, days from his 5th birthday, the same birthday his mother shared with him. He didn't run. When the man left, Jeremy climbed onto a chair, opened the freezer, and got an ice cube. He placed it gently on his mother's forehead, the way you do for someone who's hurt and you don't know what else to do. She didn't wake up. For 2 more days, Jeremy stayed beside her. He didn't leave. When a neighbor finally grew alarmed by the silence behind the apartment door and let herself in to check, she found the boy still there, still trying, wiping at the blood on his mother's nose with whatever he had in his small hands. Jasmine "Jazzy" Porter was 36 years old, 6 months pregnant. A singer, a professional one, the kind of voice people in her life remembered clearly even decades later. Her sister would describe her as outgoing almost to a fault, the kind of person who trusted everyone, who believed everyone she met deserved the benefit of the doubt. It would take 26 years, a fragment of jailhouse conversation that had nothing to do with her case at all, and a man who had already strangled a pregnant woman once before and walked free in time to do it again, before anyone learned his name. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In February 1996, Bill Clinton was in the final year of his first term as president. The crack epidemic that had devastated entire blocks of the Bronx through the 1980s was finally loosening its grip, and the citywide crime rate that had terrified New Yorkers for a generation was only just beginning the long decline that would define the rest of the decade. None of that arrived quickly or evenly. Whole neighborhoods were still living with the aftermath, even as the headlines started, slowly, to read differently. Morris Heights sat in that uneven middle ground, a neighborhood of pre-war apartment buildings built close together on the steep hills rising up from the Harlem River. The kind of place where people had lived stacked on top of each other long enough that most residents at least recognized each other's faces on the stairwell, even without knowing each other's names. It wasn't the kind of block where a stranger could move through unnoticed for long, which made what happened to Jasmine Porter even harder for the people who knew her to understand. Once they finally learned the truth of it, the man responsible hadn't come from outside the neighborhood at all. He'd been living close enough to walk there. Jasmine Porter lived at 1706 Davidson Avenue with her son. She raised him largely on her own, working, singing when she could. 6 months into a pregnancy that meant she'd soon be raising 2 children instead of 1. Her sister Shauna would remember her, years later, with a specific kind of warmth reserved for people who give more of themselves than is strictly safe to give. She was very outgoing, Shauna said, and she trusted a lot of people. Everyone was her friend. I told her everyone's not your friend. It was the kind of thing a younger sibling says about an older one they loved and worried about in equal measure. On February 5, 1996, a man entered Jasmine's apartment. Investigators would later determine that Jasmine likely didn't know him well, if at all. There was no clear relationship between them, no obvious history, nothing anyone in her life could later point to as an explanation for why this specific man, on this specific day, was inside her home. He was naked when he climbed on top of her and began to strangle her. Jeremy was in the room. He heard his mother's cries. He heard her telling him to run. He stayed. When the man left, the apartment fell into the particular silence that follows violence, not peaceful, just empty in a way that makes the air itself feel different. Jeremy, 4 years old, climbed onto a kitchen chair. He pulled open the freezer door. He took out a single ice cube, the way he might have watched someone do once, for a bruise, for a fever, for anything that needed cooling down and easing. He carried it to his mother and pressed it, gently, against her forehead. She had already stopped breathing. He stayed with her anyway. There was nowhere else for a 4-year-old to go. No understanding yet of what had actually happened, only the dim, persistent sense that something was deeply wrong and that leaving her side wasn't an option his body would let him choose. For 2 full days, Jeremy remained in that apartment with his mother's body. A neighbor, eventually disturbed enough by the silence, and investigators later suggested by what the silence had started to carry with it, let herself in to check. What she found was a small boy still trying, still working at the dried blood on his mother's face with whatever was in his hands. Days after it had stopped mattering to anyone but him. When officers arrived, they found Jasmine Porter dead, the cause strangulation, days after the fact. Beneath her fingernails, investigators recovered scrapings, the specific kind of evidence that exists only because a person fought back, clawed at whoever was hurting them, held on to whatever they could reach in the last moments they had any say in the matter. Jasmine had fought. In 1996, DNA testing existed, but only in a slow, early, expensive form, useful mainly in cases where investigators already had a suspect in hand to test the evidence against. There was no system yet built for finding a complete stranger from biological material alone. The fingernail scrapings were logged, sealed, and placed into evidence storage, exactly the way procedure required. With no name to compare them to, they had nowhere to go. They simply waited. Detectives worked the case hard in the weeks that followed. They talked to Jasmine's neighbors. They talked to her friends. They pursued a theory that she might have crossed paths with someone at a party not long before her death, hoping that thread might lead somewhere concrete. None of it produced a name anyone could charge. The case went cold, and it stayed cold for 25 years. Jeremy grew up the way a child grows up after surviving something like that, raised by his grandparents, surrounded by people who loved him fiercely, carrying a particular kind of absence that no amount of love around him could ever fully close. He celebrated birthdays that had always, since the day he was born, also belonged to his mother. Every single one of those birthdays after 1996 carried that double weight quietly, whether anyone around the cake said so out loud or not. Through all of it, Jasmine's fingernail scrapings sat exactly where they had been placed in 1996, through new mayors, new police commissioners, new advances in forensic science that were solving other cities' cold cases, one after another, while hers sat untouched. Simply because nobody had circled back to ask whether the technology had finally caught up to what was already sitting in storage. In 2021, Bronx homicide detective Robert Klein was working on something else entirely when a piece of recorded jailhouse chatter crossed his desk. Two people talking. Jasmine's name surfacing almost by accident, in a conversation that had nothing directly to do with identifying her killer at all. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a real lead in the conventional sense. Nothing in it pointed toward a specific name. But it was enough to send Klein back into a case file that hadn't been seriously reopened in 2.5 decades. That's where he found it, the fingernail scrapings, still exactly where they'd been placed 25 years earlier, never once tested against anything more advanced than what 1996 had offered. He sent the sample out for modern analysis. The result came back, a match to Gregory Fleetwood, a man already sitting in the system, not because of anything connected to Jasmine, but because of something he'd done nearly a decade before her, to a different woman entirely. In 1987, Fleetwood had strangled a pregnant woman named Linda Miller. The charge against him had originally been murder. It was reduced to manslaughter, and Fleetwood served 7 years, the minimum sentence, at Cape Vincent Correctional Facility upstate. He was released in August 1994. Less than 2 years later, Jasmine Porter was dead, killed the same way, in the same condition Linda Miller had been in when he killed her. When investigators finally brought Fleetwood in for questioning, he denied any wrongdoing entirely. But under sustained questioning, he stumbled, making statements that placed him on the specific block where Jasmine had lived, a detail he had no innocent explanation for knowing. The DNA match did more than confirm one murder. It also tied Fleetwood to 2 separate, unrelated rape cases that had never been connected to him before. And even that wasn't the full picture. In 1984, a woman had accused him of raping and strangling her. Her own family pressured her not to testify, and the case died there, unprosecuted. In March of 1996, barely a month after Jasmine, another woman was attacked in nearly identical fashion. She died before she ever had the chance to press charges against him. Gregory Fleetwood had been moving through the Bronx for decades, leaving a trail of violence that almost nobody had ever connected into a single pattern, because almost nobody had ever had a reason to go looking for one. On August 8, 2022, he was arrested. 66 years old by then, his last known address on Laconia Avenue, roughly 5 miles from Davidson Avenue, close enough that he could have walked the distance more than once over the decades without drawing a second glance from anyone. Jasmine's brother, Derek Porter, hadn't even heard the name Gregory Fleetwood until the day of the arrest. "I believe firmly that you get by," he said afterward, "but you don't get away. You have to answer for your deeds." This person was going to get his anyway. Detective Klein would later describe the case, in an interview with the New York Daily News, as the pinnacle of my career. Jasmine's sister Shauna could barely get through a sentence about him without her voice breaking. "That detective, I have tears in my eyes when I think of Detective Klein," she said. "What he did for our family. He treated Jasmine like she was his own sister." The case moved through the courts slowly after that, years of the kind of procedural grinding that produces no headlines and gives a family nothing concrete to hold on to. Only more waiting stacked directly on top of 25 years of waiting they had already endured. On December 10, 2025, Gregory Fleetwood pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. On January 29, 2026, 29 years almost to the day after he choked the life out of Jasmine Porter, he stood before Bronx Supreme Court Justice Ralph Fabrizio for sentencing. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark's office did not soften any part of what they said about him. 3 decades ago, the defendant carried out a horrific attack on a pregnant woman with her 5-year-old son forced to bear witness, the DA's office said. After a relentless pursuit of justice, including advancements in DNA, her killer is being held accountable, and there is some solace for her child. Justice Fabrizio sentenced Fleetwood to 12 years in prison. 12 years. For a man who had already served 7 for strangling one pregnant woman, walked free, and then strangled a second one in front of her own 4-year-old son less than 2 years later. 12 years was what remained once the original murder charge had been negotiated down to manslaughter. Not what anyone connected to Jasmine would ever call enough, but the only number the plea agreement left on the table for the judge to work with. The case had been prosecuted by Christine Scaccia, chief of the Homicide Bureau. The district attorney's office specifically credited David Slott, chief of the Forensic Science Unit, along with forensic coordinator Roberta Graham and forensic analyst Lindsay Carter, the people who, 3 decades after the fact, finally sat down and read what had been waiting under a dying woman's fingernails the entire time. Here is how this case actually came together, in order. Fingernail scrapings, taken from a woman who fought for her life in February 1996. Preserved through 25 years in storage with no name to test them against. A fragment of overheard jail conversation in 2021 that had nothing to do with Jasmine Porter directly, but happened to land on the desk of the one detective willing to reopen an old file because of it. A DNA match to a man already sitting in the system, not because of her, but because of Linda Miller, nearly a decade earlier. A stumbled answer under police questioning that placed him exactly where he had no business knowing to be. And a 4-year-old boy who got an ice cube from a freezer because it was the only thing in the entire world he knew how to do. Take away any one of those 5 things, and Gregory Fleetwood finishes out his life never once connected to what happened on Davidson Avenue. Nobody was ever made to answer for the 7-year sentence that put a man who had already strangled one pregnant woman back on the street in August 1994, less than 2 years before he did it again. Nobody was ever made to answer for what happened to the woman in 1984, whose own family talked her out of testifying. Nobody was ever made to answer for the woman in March of 1996, who died before she got the chance to press charges at all. 3 women, at minimum, possibly more. One system, deciding more than once that 7 years was an acceptable price for what he'd already done. He lived 5 miles from Jasmine for years afterward. Nobody on either block had any reason to know exactly what he'd already done, or what he remained fully capable of doing again. This case leaves behind 2 things worth carrying forward. First, evidence that can't be tested today doesn't mean it's gone for good. Jasmine's fingernail scrapings sat in an evidence room for 25 years, useless under 1996 technology, but never discarded, which is exactly why modern testing was able to use them at all, the moment someone finally circled back to look. If you have a loved one in a cold case where biological evidence was collected but produced no match, ask the investigating agency directly whether that evidence has been preserved and whether it's eligible for retesting under current forensic methods. That conversation can start with your local police department's cold case unit. Second, a reduced charge in one case can ripple forward into consequences far beyond that single case. Fleetwood's 1987 murder charge became manslaughter, and the 7 years that followed put him back on the street years before Jasmine Porter ever crossed his path, and possibly before at least one other woman did too. If you believe a plea agreement or reduced sentence in a violent case deserves more public scrutiny, county district attorneys' offices maintain sentencing records that are part of the public record and available for you to review directly. If this story made you think, please press subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for watching until the very end. Davidson Avenue is still there. The same pre-war buildings still climb the same hill above the Harlem River in Morris Heights, the same as they did in February 1996. Jeremy is an adult now, raised by his grandparents, still carrying 2 days inside that apartment that never fully left him. The ice cube against her forehead, the silence afterward, the neighbor finding him still trying to clean his mother's face with whatever he had in his small hands. He never got to know her as anything other than the person he tried and couldn't save. He never got to meet the sibling she was 6 months away from having. Jasmine "Jazzy" Porter